Hey guys, tonight we wander into twilight Istanbul, lanterns flickering, tulip petals underfoot, and the faint scent of rosewater wafting through the air like a rumor. You step carefully along the cobbled paths of a courtyard that's more whisper than walkway, where the marble stays warm from the day and the shadows of minarets stretch long like sleepy cats. The call to prayer has just faded, and the city exhales. It is, in many ways, the most Ottoman of hours. When the heat relents, the tea is poured, and even the mosques seem to sigh in relief. You round a corner near the Topkapi Palace, catching a glimpse of a lantern seller packing up his wares. Beside him, a group of young boys squabble over a game that may or may not involve cheating, and a man in a turban taller than necessary carefully pets a cat who clearly outranks him. You probably wouldn't survive long here. Not because of danger, but because the city is dense with etiquette, subtle glances, and entire conversations held in eyebrow movements. Still, you're here, and your robes are only slightly wrinkled. You'll manage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment below to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass under an archway and into a quieter part of the city. Here the air is cooler and the cobblestones are cracked in more poetic ways. You catch sight of an old man sweeping fallen petals into a golden dustpan. Not leaves, petals. Mostly tulip. Because in this version of Istanbul, the early 18th century, the tulip is not just a flower. It's a vibe, a currency, a language, a phase. And you're about to step straight into it. Here's your mainstream fact. During the early 1700s, the Ottoman Empire experienced what became known as the Tulip Era, a period of cultural flourishing, diplomacy, and extravagance where the tulip became an imperial obsession. You stroll along the edge of a garden wall, where even the iron latticework is shaped like tulips curling toward a stylized sun. The guards nearby wear slippers embroidered with flower patterns. A dog sleeps nearby, its tail twitching in the scent of rosewater. No one rushes. The entire city seems paused in a quiet inhale. You find yourself at the edge of a reflecting pool, where lilies float like idle courtiers, and yes, tulips bloom in planters shaped like miniature mosques. Someone has placed a silver mirror on the water's surface, and a passing breeze causes it to ripple just enough to make your face look wiser than it is. You take a seat beside the pool. The stone is cool beneath you. A cup of sherbet, somewhere between fruit punch and alchemy, is handed to you by a passing servant who might be a ghost. You sip. It tastes like chilled sunlight and whatever mint dreams of at night. Here's your quirky tidbit. It was common for elite Ottomans to host nighttime garden parties, in which guests would admire tulips illuminated by floating oil lamps. Sometimes the tulips were dyed. Sometimes the guests were. You glance at a tulip swaying beside you, striped red and cream, petals almost impossibly symmetrical. Historians still argue whether the Tulip Era was a genuine renaissance or an elite distraction from growing unrest within the empire. Either way, the petals were real. The parties were lavish. And the sherbet? Sublime. You recline a little, your feet stretched out toward the pool, and behind the high walls, somewhere inside the palace, the Sultan is planning a flower party that will cost more than your grandfather's entire village. But for now, in this moment, in this city humming with quiet extravagance, you sit. You sip. And the tulips bloom for you. You rise from the edge of the reflecting pool with a stretch, the last sips of sherbet still tingling on your tongue. Somewhere a flute begins to play, thin and high, like a thread of silk being pulled through the evening. You follow the sound, feet brushing fallen petals as you pass through a narrow walkway lined with lanterns. Each one casts tulip-shaped shadows on the stone. You're heading toward the heart of it all now, the epicenter of the empire's most fragrant fascination. And there, behind a wrought iron gate so delicately carved it might have been grown rather than forged, is the man who made it all bloom. Sultan Ahmed III. He's not what you expect. No golden throne, no thunderous decree. Instead, he's reclining beneath a trellis, surrounded by advisors who seem more like florists than politicians. He wears a silk robe embroidered with, you guessed it, tulips. One of his shoes is off. He looks deeply pleased. You keep a respectful distance, of course. But you watch. Here's your mainstream fact. Sultan Ahmed III, who ruled from 1703 to 1730, presided over a period of relative peace and prosperity in the Ottoman Empire. Known for his patronage of the arts, architecture, and gardens, he embraced a lifestyle that celebrated refinement, beauty, and, most famously, tulips. He lifts a single tulip from a silver vase and examines it with the gravity of a man inspecting a treaty. Beside him, a courtier fans a scroll that appears to list bulb inventories. Another carries a ledger tracking which noble families have received which varieties as diplomatic gifts. And just to his left, someone is sketching the flower in a tiny book, tongue tucked in concentration. You sit under a fig tree, invisible enough to observe. And you wonder how this all happened. How a simple flower, imported from Central Asia, passed through Persian gardens and carried into the empire by traders, became the centerpiece of imperial fantasy. Here's your quirky tidbit. Ahmed III was so enthralled with tulips that he commissioned entire pavilions to display them, including movable garden structures that could be floated down canals. Some reports claim he once asked for tulips to be placed in golden cages for a more regal effect. You watch as a servant brings the Sultan a cup of coffee in a tulip-painted porcelain cup, the handle shaped like a stem. He sips it with great seriousness, as if the act itself might be studied by poets. Historians still argue whether the Sultan's tulip obsession was a clever soft power tactic or simply the indulgence of a bored monarch. But from your seat under the fig tree, it feels like both. A ruler who used petals the way others used armies. You wander into the garden proper, following a gravel path that curves like a sentence written in calligraphy. The tulips here are arranged not by color, but by lineage. A sign reads, Descendants of Flame Ribbon, 1709. Another, Cousins of Night Pearl, gifted by the Pasha of Edirne. Yes, tulips have names here. And you're starting to suspect they have opinions, too. You crouch near a cluster of dark purple tulips so deep they look like ink. A breeze makes them shiver, and one leans ever so slightly toward you. Judgment? Approval? You can't be sure. Above the garden, lanterns begin to glow, soft orange flames bobbing in glass globes. The sky deepens into indigo. The party is beginning, though no one's rushing. The tulips don't approve of rushing. You pass a fountain shaped like a tulip opening, its water trickling from each petal into a shallow basin below. Someone's placed rose petals on the surface. You imagine they'll float there all night. You find a bench. You sit. The Sultan is laughing now, holding a particularly flamboyant tulip as if it had told him a good joke. A few courtiers chuckle along. One sneezes delicately, and in the garden, beneath the stars and the glow of tulip lanterns, everything slows. You lean your head back. The empire may be vast, the palace may be gilded, but right now, the world is only as big as a tulip bulb. And you're blooming too. You wake the next morning in a small guest chamber tucked behind the outer garden walls, with linen curtains fluttering and the smell of wet grass reaching your nose before your eyes even open. The tulips are up already. Of course they are. They always rise before you do, as if racing the sun. You stretch beneath a blanket embroidered with tiny gold petals and wonder briefly if it's all a dream. But no, there's a parrot outside your window practicing a call to prayer. Badly. Still real. You dress slowly, sliding on soft slippers and stepping into the morning like it might break. The stone pathway is cool. The dew soaks through your soles by the third step. Somewhere nearby, a fountain giggles. You pass through an arched hallway and emerge into the palace's private garden, and you pause. Because today, the tulips aren't just blooming. They're competing. This is no longer the Sultan's private appreciation hour. This is display day. Rows of bulb beds have been raked into crisp lines. Gold-trimmed placards identify each breed, some with names longer than your last tax receipt. Crescent Blush of Spring, Moon-Tongued Dervish, Victory Flame of Iskender. They glisten. They glow. Some even glower. You are not alone. The vizier is there, stooped over a wine-red tulip with a magnifying lens, muttering something about symmetry. Two gardeners are mid-argument over soil acidity. A calligrapher is painting a single flower onto a scroll the size of a napkin, and perched atop a stool, carefully cradling a silver bowl of bulbs like stolen treasure, is the imperial gardener himself. Here's your mainstream fact. By the height of the Tulip Era, The palace maintained classified tulip registries, recording the names, patterns, and lineage of prized bulbs, many of which had become status symbols within the elite. Certain patterns, like broken streaks of color or a delicate flame shape, could double the value of a bulb. You kneel near a white-petaled variety dusted with pink speckles and feel slightly underdressed. A nobleman beside you sighs, "It weeps color like a heart broken in spring." You nod. "I was just thinking the same." He seems satisfied. You move on. Past the competition garden lies the greenhouse, or as they call it here, the glass pavilion. It is, quite frankly, ridiculous. Arched domes, glass imported from Venice, air perfumed by oranges and rosewater, and in the center, a single bulb on a silk pillow under protective gauze. You're not sure if it's medicine or monarchy. You lean closer. It's just a tulip, but its petals shimmer faintly with purple and green. You think of beetle shells and oil slicks, and then feel slightly guilty for comparing imperial horticulture to a bug. A woman beside you whispers, "That one bloomed on the Sultan's birthday. Now they call it Serenade Dawn." Here's your quirky tidbit. Rumors say that one favored bulb was so treasured, the palace commissioned an artisan to carve a tiny wooden cradle for it to rest in off-season, complete with silk swaddling and an embroidered canopy. No one knows what happened to it. Probably stolen. Or worse, planted. Historians still argue whether these elaborate tulip displays were meant as genuine aesthetic devotion or simply an ornate show of soft power, an attempt by the court to signal control over beauty, nature, and refinement at a time when borders were fraying. You suspect the answer is yes. You leave the greenhouse, slightly overwhelmed and deeply fragrant, and head back toward your guest quarters. A gardener offers you a cup of morning coffee with a clove twist. You accept. The breeze carries the scent of jasmine. Tulips lean slightly in the wind. You sip your coffee and whisper, "Show-offs." And in response, a passing bloom seems to nod. The afternoon heat settles like a silk blanket over Istanbul. You fan yourself gently with a folded garden schedule someone left behind, decorated, of course, with watercolor tulips, and slip through a side gate into one of the lesser-known palace courtyards. It's quieter here, less pageantry, more petals. You find a stone bench shaded by an olive tree and sit, stretching your legs and letting your eyes drift over the walls. Every tile seems to echo the same soft obsession. Tulips in bloom, tulips in profile, tulips cradled by crescent moons, their stems stylized into the shape of Arabic calligraphy. You're surrounded by flowers, real and imagined, and not one is out of place. Here's your mainstream fact. The tulip became a symbol of refined taste and perfect geometry in Ottoman culture. Artists, architects, and decorators wove tulip motifs into everything: tiles, clothing, manuscripts, even official documents. The flower was praised for its symmetry, its upward tilt, and its resemblance to the name of Allah in elegant script. You lean forward, tracing the edge of one turquoise tile with your finger. The tulip painted there is just slightly crooked, its petals off-center, its stem a little wild. You smile. A rebel. A servant walks past carrying a tray of pomegranate juice and looks at you like you belong. You wave. She nods back. Then, suddenly serious, she points at a fountain you hadn't noticed, a tall marble structure with spouts shaped like, yes, tulips. The water pours not in a stream but in rippling beads, like someone plucking a harp. You nod in appreciation. She vanishes through a curtain. You finish the juice she left you. It tastes like sunset. As the light softens, nobles begin arriving for the evening's viewing party. Not a ball, not quite a festival, but definitely something with sherbet and gossip. They step out of carriages, wearing embroidered kaftans and freshly oiled beards. Fans flutter. Laughter bounces lightly off the garden walls. You overhear one man boasting that his cousin bred a tulip with 7 distinct shades of red. Another swears a flower bloomed in the shape of a crescent moon during a lightning storm, and that it still glows faintly at night. You edge closer to a group of women seated beneath a silk-draped pavilion. They're comparing scented oil samples, each one infused with an essence from a different tulip. One smells like apricot, another like almond milk and musk. The last smells like cucumber? Refreshing, someone offers. Suspicious, someone else replies. You don't argue. Here's your quirky tidbit. During the Tulip Era, it wasn't uncommon for wealthy households to host tulip parties, where guests judged each other's bulbs and tasted floral-inspired treats, from tulip sherbets to petal-infused jams. Matching your tulip to your outfit? Expected. Naming it after a poem? Bonus points. You walk slowly through the garden now, where lamps are being lit by hand one by one, turning every blossom into a tiny torch. A child runs past with a handful of petals, tossing them like confetti. A man in velvet shoes hums a tune about unrequited love and very expensive flowers. Historians still argue whether this public adoration of tulips was a genuine artistic movement or simply a way for the Ottoman elite to distract themselves from growing unrest and economic strain. You consider this as you pass a woman arguing passionately about petal curvature with a man holding a magnifying glass. Distraction or devotion? Does it matter? The flowers are real. The lanterns are glowing. The music is soft, and the air smells like sweet lime and sandalwood. And for tonight, at least, the empire is in bloom. You wake the next morning not in your guest quarters, but in the garden, curled up beneath a silk canopy that someone, bless them, must have thrown over you during the night. Around you, the tulips are still standing, upright and smug, like they never needed sleep in the first place. There's a faint layer of dew on your sleeves. A hoopoe bird flutters by and eyes your tangled hair with judgment. You sit up slowly, brushing petals off your lap, and take a moment to rejoin the empire of the conscious. The garden is quiet, but not still. Servants move like whispers, retying lanterns, plucking yesterday's blossoms, resetting cushions. And there, not far from where you slept, is a new bed of tulips, planted overnight. You're fairly certain they weren't there yesterday. Someone is trying to outdo someone else. You nod. Respect. Here's your mainstream fact. In the Ottoman court, tulip breeding became an elite hobby and subtle power game. Nobles competed not just over wealth or title, but over who could cultivate the rarest, most unusual, or most exquisitely patterned tulip. Garden beds were coded messages of taste, status, and alliances. You wander toward the palace kitchens, not for politics, but for breakfast. A sleepy cook waves you in and offers a flatbread wrap with cheese, olives, and something sweet that may or may not be flour-based. You accept it like a sacred relic and sit on a shaded bench, chewing slowly while watching a gardener polish a watering can. Yes, polish. There's a quiet intensity to the whole place now. The party's over, but the prestige remains. Each tulip is still a declaration. Every bulb is a resume, and somewhere someone is preparing for the next round. You slip into the administrative wing, not with purpose, but with curiosity. Here, instead of petals, there are scrolls, ledgers, charts. You pass a chamber where men in turbans argue over tulip taxes. One insists the import fees are too high. Another wants to limit how many bulbs a single noble can own. A third is just here for the biscuits. You lean in as a clerk explains that striped bulbs should carry an additional luxury levy unless proven locally bred. You blink. That's either absurd or brilliant. Maybe both. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are records of imperial officials using coded language to discuss tulip trade, with certain bulb types nicknamed after birds, musical scales, or dessert dishes, to confuse eavesdroppers, or perhaps just to amuse themselves. You glance at a ledger labeled chiffon swans and decide not to ask. Historians still argue whether this overregulation of flower trade was a sign of state control tightening or unraveling. You stand quietly in the corridor, watching a man in a red sash argue passionately about whether a double flame-tip tulip should be taxed as one bulb or two. You quietly sidestep a spilled tray of ink and retreat. The hallway exits into a long balcony that overlooks a private garden, a smaller one built not for show, but for solitude. It's here that you find a small boy, perhaps 10 years old, carefully watering a single tulip with a cup. He doesn't look up, doesn't speak, just waters, turns the cup in his hand and waters again. You sit beside him, not speaking either, because this moment isn't about opulence or display. It's just a tulip, a child, and quiet. And in that pause, the flower is not a symbol. It's just a flower. And it's enough. You leave the quiet garden slowly, stepping back into the world of petals and politics, where every tulip is part of someone's strategy. The breeze has picked up now, carrying with it the faint scent of cinnamon and ink. Someone is baking, and someone else is writing poems again. You turn a corner and almost stumble into a merchant unloading crates of bulbs. He's sweating, muttering about customs paperwork and rare soil additives. You nod politely, then notice a tag on one crate that reads, Whispering Candle. Price negotiable. Buyer must swear not to share. Right? You continue on through one of the open market squares just beyond the palace wall. This one is unofficial, run by middlemen, ambitious gardeners, and the occasional black market poet. Here, tulips aren't just grown, they're traded, whispered about, and sometimes smuggled in from across the Bosphorus inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Here's your mainstream fact. As tulip fever spread through the Ottoman elite, bulb trading expanded beyond the palace gardens. Informal networks sprang up throughout Istanbul and beyond, with some rare varieties being bought and sold for absurd sums, and with secrecy often playing a bigger role than botany. You pause at a stall selling hand-painted tulip guides, each page featuring a specific bloom, its origin, known rivals, and a space to record emotional impressions. One man flips through the book with the same reverence others reserve for holy texts. He sighs. This one? It's weepy. You nod gravely. You round another corner and find yourself near a modest cafe where two scholars are deep in conversation. Their table is stacked with charts, sketches, and tiny bulbs laid out on embroidered cloth. They don't argue. They whisper, debate, hum in agreement. Too much soil acidity, says one. Not enough moonlight, replies the other. You take a seat near them, order rosewater tea, and pretend to read a newspaper that's 3 weeks out of date. You're really just listening. One scholar leans in conspiratorially. Did you hear? A new tulip from Anatolia. Deep blue, nearly black. Impossible, the other says, eyes gleaming. They go silent. Then both scribble notes furiously. Here's your quirky tidbit. Certain Ottoman tulip enthusiasts believe that perfect flowers must never be named after people, only ideas, thus giving rise to names like the breath of patience, ink of twilight, or the sigh that waited too long. It made tulip conversations sound more like poetry contests than trade deals. You sip your tea, which tastes like sunlight filtered through linen. You wander the rest of the market, admiring stalls lined with tulip-patterned tiles, silk scarves embroidered with curling stems, and tiny silver tulip charms worn as tokens of love, or as anti-jealousy amulets, depending on whom you ask. Historians still argue whether this tulip frenzy was a fleeting bubble or a symptom of cultural shift, a longing for beauty in a changing empire. Some say it was harmless. Others say it was decadent. You just know the tulips keep blooming, and everyone seems a little drunk on them. You return to the palace by way of a canal lined with cypress trees, the path dappled with light and the occasional lost petal. A child floats a tiny paper boat covered in tulip drawings beside you, humming something you don't recognize but instantly like. You arrive at your quarters and pause. Someone has left a tulip on your doorstep. It's small, yellow, ordinary, and somehow that makes it perfect. You pick it up, twirl it between your fingers, and smile. Because sometimes, in an empire of extravagance, simplicity is the rarest bloom of all. Late afternoon folds itself into the palace gardens like an embroidered napkin, gently, gracefully, with just a hint of theatrics. You find yourself back near the central courtyard, watching as a row of lanterns is preemptively trimmed and refilled for evening. There's a man whose only job, it seems, is to ensure each wick is aesthetically appropriate. He frowns at a crooked one. You silently root for it. You wander past the reflecting pool again, where a few noble women sit reading poetry aloud to each other, poems exclusively about tulips, naturally. One line you catch, and if her glance be cruel, may it at least be petal-shaped. You nod. Harsh, but fair. You continue down a hallway you haven't tried before. It's quieter, lined with pale blue tiles and windows overlooking a smaller inner garden. No fountains here, just rows and rows of tulips arranged in abstract shapes, some resembling stars, others spelling out calligraphic phrases if you squint hard enough. This, you learn, is the poetry garden. Here's your mainstream fact. During the Tulip Era, elite Ottomans, especially court poets and artists, frequently used tulips as metaphors in verse. The flower came to symbolize perfection, spiritual yearning, and bittersweet beauty. Entire collections of poems were devoted to specific tulip varieties, some written in the form of garden maps. You take a seat on a low wall and listen to the silence, or rather the structured quiet. Somewhere, someone is snipping dead petals. Somewhere else, a lute is being tuned. A servant walks by balancing a tray with a single teacup and a single tulip in a vase. You are unsure which is more important. A low voice hums nearby. You glance over. It's an elderly man in embroidered robes, seated on a cushion, carefully painting tulip bulbs in miniature on a thin strip of parchment. He doesn't look up, but he speaks. They say the first tulip grew from a drop of longing. You raise an eyebrow. And the second, he smiles, regret. He invites you to sit, offers you a brush. You decline with exaggerated horror, claiming you'd paint the stem upside down. He chuckles and returns to his work. Here's your quirky tidbit. Miniature artists in the Ottoman court often trained for decades to perfect botanical illustration. They used ultrafine brushes made from squirrel hair and sometimes painted using a single hair tip. A poorly rendered tulip leaf could be a scandal. You watch his hand steady, calm, deliberate, as he adds a sliver of light to a petal. This one is for the Grand Vizier, he murmurs. He prefers purple streaks. Dramatic, you offer. Understandably, he says. Historians still argue whether the intense symbolism tied to tulips reflected genuine spiritual depth or was simply fashionable affectation. You decide it's probably both. And honestly, you're okay with that. Sincerity and spectacle aren't mutually exclusive here. You rise and thank the painter. He gives a slight bow and dips his brush again. You pass through the final archway of the poetry garden and find a bench under a flowering tree. Not a tulip tree, just a regular one. The shade is deep. The breeze has softened. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the scent of petals and ink settle over you like a silk veil. And in that hush, you begin to understand. This isn't just a flower craze. It's a quiet religion, a belief in symmetry, a hope that beauty might delay decay, and beneath it all, a longing for something fleeting and too perfect to stay. You wake to the sound of footsteps, measured, official, and slightly annoyed. A palace clerk with ink-stained fingers is pacing the edge of the poetry garden, muttering about inventory, debts, and someone ordering 400 bulbs without a planting plan. You quietly slip away. The palace is buzzing again, and not with bees. News has arrived. A rare tulip from the eastern provinces has bloomed ahead of schedule. Deep violet, almost black, with a faint silver rim. They're calling it the Emperor's Whisper, and suddenly everyone wants to whisper about it. You follow the chatter toward the Imperial Bulb Registry Office, where all things petal-related become bureaucracy. The room is packed. Noblemen in feathered turbans argue gently, more posture than passion. Courtiers lean over velvet ropes to catch glimpses of a painted scroll displaying the whisper. Gardeners pace with that special urgency only gardeners know. The weather is changing, and someone forgot to mulch. Here's your mainstream fact. During the height of the Tulip Era, the Ottomans developed highly detailed records of tulip breeds, prices, and exchanges. Bulbs were weighed, measured, taxed, and sometimes gifted as political tokens. It was part botany, part accounting, part social theater. A young clerk with sleep-deprived eyes unfurls a scroll beside you. It lists bulb prices from the last market day. Some cost more than silk robes. One is marked indefinable, which may mean priceless or someone forgot the number. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. It glows. You don't ask. Outside the registry, you join a trail of people heading toward a garden you haven't yet seen. This one is newer, commissioned just months ago, they say, by a particularly competitive pasha with a fondness for purple. You arrive at the edge of a manicured lawn that's more stage than soil. In the center is the Emperor's Whisper, protected behind a sheer veil of muslin, guarded by two soldiers who look mildly embarrassed by the assignment. People murmur. Someone starts a sketch. A poet tries a verse and gives up halfway through. You approach the flower slowly. It's exquisite, yes. But what catches your attention isn't the color. It's the way the petals curl at the tips, like the corners of a knowing smile. The stem leans slightly, like it's eavesdropping. It's showing off. And why not? Here's your quirky tidbit. Stories circulated that some elite tulip owners would hire musicians to play lute melodies for their most prized bulbs, believing the right vibrations could improve color intensity. Whether true or not, many flowers in palace gardens were placed near fountains, tuned to sing in specific tones. You listen now. You swear you hear a soft trickle, water flowing through a carved tulip spout. Perhaps that's what the flower is listening to. Historians still argue whether the emperor's whisper was a true varietal or an embellished myth, whether such a flower ever actually bloomed in palace gardens or was invented later by nostalgic poets. But in this moment, it's very real. And surrounded by petals, guards, and gossip, it's also very tired of being admired. You bow slightly. It doesn't respond. Back in the courtyard, the conversation has shifted. People are talking about the cost of bulbs, the number of new registries, the whispers of fraud. Too many petals, not enough soil, one man mutters. You decide you've seen enough of tulip politics for today. So you retreat out the garden gate, down the stone corridor, past a row of cats sleeping like furry commas on windowsills, and return to your quarters. Inside, on your pillow, someone has left a single tulip. No name, no label. Just a bloom, simple red, upright, proud. You lie beside it, close your eyes, and feel the empire spinning around flowers and the weight of wanting. By the time you open your eyes the next morning, something in the air has changed. It's not the weather, still crisp and golden. Not the tulips, they remain absurdly beautiful and faintly judgmental. No, it's the murmurs. The palace garden paths buzz differently now. Less poetry, more suspicion. You hear it in the way people greet each other. Smiles trimmed short, whispers slipping like smoke between fingers. A scribe scurries past holding a ledger to his chest like a shield. A gardener mutters, "Too many bulbs, too fast." Something's brewing. And for once, it's not tea. You walk through the garden's eastern gate and nearly trip over a broken pot. A trail of disturbed soil leads to a patch of trampled tulips, petals flattened, stems snapped. An accident? A warning? You glance around. No one meets your eyes. Here's your mainstream fact. As tulip prices skyrocketed, accusations of hoarding, theft, and even counterfeiting began to emerge. Some nobles were rumored to falsify bulb pedigrees, or to graft dyed petals onto common flowers to trick buyers. Trust wilted as fast as overwatered bulbs. You follow the path toward the back of the registry office. The door is ajar. Inside, a group of officials huddle around a desk, voices low and tense. One gestures toward a scroll listing last month's bulb values. Another slams a fist on the table. You hear the word collapse. A servant slips in and closes the door behind her with the softest click you've ever heard. Outside, a man is shouting in the marketplace. Not loudly, but with the trembling fury of someone who spent a year's salary on what turned out to be a tulip that blooms beige. You turn a corner and see a small crowd gathered around a cracked vase. The bulb inside has gone soft, already rotting. No one says anything. They just look at it, then walk away. One woman stops you and hisses, "They sold me a poem and gave me a potato." Here's your quirky tidbit. During the late Tulip Era, some satirical poets began writing mock odes to fake flowers, poking fun at the obsession and planting doubt among the once adoring public. These verses often circulated anonymously and were known as petal curses. You find one later, scrawled on a scrap of parchment under a bench. "O tulip, born of ink and lies, you bloom in pockets, not in skies." Ouch. Historians still argue whether the shift from adoration to anxiety was economic or emotional, whether people turned on tulips because of fraud or because beauty, once assigned value, becomes fragile. You suspect both, or neither. Maybe things just got too loud. You retreat again, walking along the outer canal. It's quieter here. The water's still. You see a gardener uprooting an entire bed of tulips, healthy ones. He doesn't look angry. Just tired. You sit on a bench and watch a pair of ducks paddle by, utterly disinterested in tulip futures. And in that silence, you realize something. No one's admiring the flowers today. They're still blooming, still elegant, but no one looks. As if beauty, once monetized, had to be ignored to survive. You lie back, hands behind your head, letting the sun warm your face. You think about petals, names, ledgers, and how fast love turns suspicious when gold gets involved. And somewhere nearby, a tulip blooms unseen. Its petals wide, its silence loud. You rise slowly from the bench, dusting fallen petals from your robe. The canal path winds back toward the heart of the palace, but you take the longer route, the one lined with fig trees and soft rumors. People nod more curtly now. The tulip smile has disappeared, replaced with tight lips and careful steps. You overhear snippets. 3 bulbs, one of them didn't sprout. They say the vizier's gardener fled. The market, did you hear? Frozen. No trades today. You reach the main square to find a crowd, not unruly, but hushed. At its center stands a small platform, and on that platform, a shattered vase. Beside it, a tulip bulb in a shallow dish, dried, cracked, symbolic. A court official reads a list aloud. New regulations, bulb quotas, registry suspensions. You hear murmurs of confiscations. Taxes. The word overreach lands like an unexpected sneeze in a quiet room. Here's your mainstream fact. In the final years of the Tulip Era, the Ottoman government attempted to rein in the bulb trade by issuing edicts that limited production, capped prices, and punished fraudulent sellers. The efforts were too late to stop the cultural unraveling, and may have even fueled the unrest. You spot the man who painted tulips in the poetry garden. His hands are ink-stained, his satchel bulging with rolled-up miniatures. He looks at the shattered vase and sighs, not out of shock, just familiarity. You join him in silence. And then he mutters, "They asked me yesterday to paint roses." You both wince. Later that day, you're called, yes you, to observe a quiet tribunal in one of the palace's back chambers. It's not dramatic. Just 6 men and 1 woman seated in semicircle, reviewing scrolls, inspecting bulbs, and trying to determine what's real and what's not. You watch as one bulb is sliced in half to check for color streaks. Another is weighed. A third is sniffed. One man leans forward. "This one smells like candle wax." The others nod like that means something. Here's your quirky tidbit. In an attempt to stabilize tulip authenticity, the palace briefly employed imperial testers, people tasked with evaluating bulbs based on smell, color, shape, and even folklore. No 2 testers agreed on the same standards, and the role was quietly dissolved. You leave the tribunal with your head spinning. Outside, the wind has picked up. A gust sends a swirl of petals across the courtyard like a floral sandstorm. Someone ducks. Historians still argue whether the decline of tulip culture marked the end of refinement or the beginning of realism. Did the empire lose its way in flowers, or merely outgrow them? You return to your quarters. On your windowsill, a single tulip wilting slightly. No note, just the flower, tilting left, a little tired. You sit beside it, chin in hand, watching the last rays of sun catch its fading color. And as the shadows lengthen, you realize the tulips didn't fail. They were asked to carry too much. To symbolize beauty, prestige, wealth, power, diplomacy, refinement, eternity, the empire itself. And in the end, they were just flowers. And flowers don't last forever, but they bloom anyway. Evening returns to Istanbul, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a soft hush that slides down the walls of the palace like silk. You step out into the garden again, but it feels different now. Quieter. Almost embarrassed. No poetry tonight. No lantern-lit lute solos. Just the rustle of wind through stems and the occasional shuffle of a gardener pulling up bulbs by moonlight. You pass by the main tulip beds where once crowds lingered, cooing over curve and color. Now, empty. A single tulip remains in a corner pot, half-tilted, petals bruised from the breeze. You crouch beside it, whisper something encouraging. It leans slightly, as if listening. You walk the edge of the reflecting pool. Its surface is still, too still. Gone are the floating flower trays, the mirror discs, the painted boats carrying sherbet and shy compliments. The pool just reflects now. The sky, the emptiness, you. Here's your mainstream fact. After the Patrona Halil revolt of 1730, sparked in part by public resentment of elite excesses, the Tulip Era came to a crashing halt. Sultan Ahmed III was deposed, tulip gardens were destroyed, and many who had once profited from the bloom boom suddenly found themselves out of favor, or out of sight. You find an old cushion still sitting in a pavilion corner, forgotten after last week's garden recital. It smells faintly of cinnamon and abandonment. You sit, lean back, and stare up through the thin cloth canopy. No one's singing. No one's buying. But the tulips? They're still blooming, because they don't know they've fallen out of fashion. A servant passes carrying a crate of bulbs. She doesn't look up. You notice she's not heading toward the garden, but toward the cellar. Safe storage, or quiet burial. A man in scholar's robes walks past, shaking his head. "We wrote sonnets to dirt," he mutters. You want to argue. You want to say it wasn't about dirt. It was about possibility. Pattern, precision, maybe even joy. But you say nothing. You rise from the cushion and take the long walk back to the registry building. Most of the scrolls are gone now. Only a few remain, curling at the corners. One shows a tulip with curling green leaves and crimson stripes. You recognize it. You saw it 3 days ago, center stage, the victory flame of Iskender. Now, rolled up, unnamed, priced to discard. Here's your quirky tidbit. After the collapse of tulip fever, some miniaturists were instructed to paint over their old flower studies, reusing parchment for more practical subjects, ledgers, property maps, naval sketches. A few resisted. Their work survives only in the margins, where tulip petals peek out from behind trade routes. Historians still argue whether this backlash was moral, economic, or simply inevitable. That all things beautiful, once they peak, must fade. That all petals fall. You leave the building. Outside, in a low bed near the palace's western wall, a few stubborn bulbs have sprouted. No names, no guards, no parties. Just growth. Because the soil remembers, even when the empire forgets. The next morning, you wake early, earlier than usual, even before the call to prayer. The sky is barely a suggestion of light, the city still swaddled in a gray hush. You throw on a robe and step outside barefoot. The stone is cold beneath your feet, but it feels right, honest. You wander back through the garden, where only the most determined tulips still stand. A few gardeners move like ghosts, trimming away the last of the glory days. Their baskets aren't lined with velvet today, just burlap. You pause beside a small patch where someone has written, with tulip petals, the word enough. You nod. You continue toward the back alleys of the palace grounds, where the tulips never quite made it, where kitchen scraps feed courtyard cats and the walls are lined with soot instead of silk. Here the bloom never boomed, and it never burst either. A woman sweeping the stoop eyes you curiously. "You're one of the flower people, huh?" she says, with a mix of fondness and exasperation. You admit it. You were. She shrugs. They were pretty. Then she gestures to a planter where a few herbs grow beside a patch of wildflowers. Bright, tangled, untrained. They don't need scrolls, she says. They just need space. Here's your mainstream fact. In the wake of the Tulip Era's collapse, many common people viewed the movement not with anger, but with a sort of wistful bemusement. For them, the end of tulip culture wasn't a crisis. It was simply the end of a story they were never really part of. You walk back toward the market district. It's quieter these days. The bulb stalls are gone, replaced with carts selling dates, clay pots, even old tulip vases now filled with lentils. No one talks about color streaks or leaf width anymore. They talk about rain, rent, rice. A man offers you a slice of melon. You accept it gratefully. He leans in and says, "You know, I still keep one bulb in my windowsill." You smile. "Why?" He shrugs. "Makes me feel rich, in a weird way." You continue to the edge of the Bosphorus, where sea meets sky in a slow blue yawn. The air is brisk, the wind sharp with salt. Across the water, you spot a tiny patch of green clinging to the rocks. Wild tulips, maybe. Or weeds. Hard to say from this distance. And you think, maybe that's better. Here's your quirky tidbit. Wild tulips still grow across parts of Anatolia and Central Asia. They're shorter, scrappier, and bloom without fanfare. But some scholars believe those ancient varieties carry the truest form, the ones the emirs and sultans first fell in love with, before the names and scrolls and scandals. Historians still argue whether the Tulip Era was foolish or brave, whether chasing beauty ever truly makes sense. But as you watch the sunlight hit the waves and scatter like petals, you realize, of course it doesn't make sense. That's why it matters. Because sometimes a flower is not about the soil it comes from or the silver it's worth. Sometimes it's just about watching something bloom, knowing it won't last, and loving it anyway. You spend the rest of the day doing something the palace once considered frivolous, walking without purpose. No registries to consult, no buey, no garden parties to dress for. Just the soft clack of your sandals on stone and the occasional nod from passers-by who, like you, seem both relieved and slightly bewildered by the calm. You pass a shuttered flower stall. The awning still bears faint streaks of paint, yellow tulips arcing around faded calligraphy. The owner is sitting out front now, carving small wooden combs. He doesn't look sad, just repurposed. You wave. He holds one up. "Want one shaped like a tulip?" You grin. "Only if it makes my hair poetic," he laughs. You keep walking. Here's your mainstream fact. After the Tulip Era faded, many of the artisans who had specialized in tulip-themed goods adapted their skills. Carving, embroidery, miniature painting, to new motifs. Roses became the new favorite. But the tulip, though out of style, never quite vanished. It just went quiet. You step into a quiet courtyard near the old archives. A lone miniaturist is there, hunched over a fresh sheet of parchment, painting. Not flowers, but fish. He looks up. They don't riot over fish, he says with a tired smile. You join him for a moment, watching the steady brushwork, the fine lines, the ink that spreads like sleep across the page. There's something restful about it, less urgent, less performative. You notice a second page tucked nearby, a tulip, half finished. He follows your gaze. I still paint them, he says, just smaller now. You nod, understand completely. You make your way back toward the outer gardens, what's left of them. Most beds have been turned, some replanted with vegetables. One has been covered entirely in smooth river stones with a single plaque. Here grew silence. You find a low bench in the shade of a fig tree and sit, watching a group of children race around a fountain. One of them has a tulip tucked behind her ear. It bounces as she runs, absurd and cheerful. No one tells her to take it off. Here's your quirky tidbit. For years after the fall of the Tulip Era, common citizens would use tulip imagery in quiet acts of satire, naming goats after flowers, painting crude tulips on latrine doors, or using flower terms as jokes in puppet shows. But eventually, the laughter softened. The tulip became tender again. Historians still argue whether this return to gentleness was nostalgia, irony, or a genuine rediscovery of simplicity. But watching that tulip bounce behind a child's ear, you suspect it doesn't matter. You close your eyes. The sun warms your knees. A bird trills overhead, sounding suspiciously like it's trying out a new poem. And you think, maybe the point of all this wasn't beauty or power or price. Maybe it was permission. To admire, to fuss over petals, to whisper to flowers, to chase something fleeting, just because it made you feel alive. As the sun sinks low again over Istanbul, casting the domes and minarets in a honeyed glow, you find yourself drifting, physically and otherwise. No particular destination, no appointment to keep. Just you, your sandals, and the long shadows of a fading empire. You reach the edge of the palace gardens and stand there for a moment, half in, half out. The last tulips catch the light like stained glass. They don't demand your attention anymore. They simply accept it, if given. A quiet dignity. Beyond the gates, the city hums. Life continues. Bakers yelling across alleys, dervishes spinning through open courtyards, fishermen grumbling over prices as cats judge them from barrels. You turn left. You end up at a small print shop in a narrow lane, the kind of place where parchment curls with age and ink stains have names. The printer waves you in. I've been saving this, he says, sliding a thin booklet across the table. It's bound in twine. The title, barely visible in faded ink, whispers of the tulip. Inside, poems, drawings, garden layouts, rumors, regrets. A scrapbook of an era now gone. You sit on a stool in the back room and read, candlelight dancing over the pages. Here's your mainstream fact. In the decades after the Tulip Era, underground collections like this one, half archive, half elegy, circulated among poets, artists, and sentimentalists. They preserved tulip culture not as triumph, but as memory. As longing made paper. You flip to a page with a small hand-painted tulip, red and gold. Underneath it a line written in careful script. I gave it a name no one would ever say, so I could keep it. You close the book gently. Back outside, the night is blooming in its own way. Lamplight glowing, the Bosphorus catching reflections like a long mirror, the sound of fiddles echoing from a rooftop too high to name. You follow the stone path back toward your quarters. On the way, you pass a boy selling painted tiles. He tries to pitch you on a rose design, but pauses when he notices your gaze resting on the older stock. The tulip tiles. He shrugs. Nobody wants those now. You pick one up. It's chipped at the corner. The glaze is cracked. But the tulip's still there, arched, precise, quietly reaching toward something no one can quite name. You hand him a coin. He hands you a piece of history. Here's your quirky tidbit. Long after tulips fell from political favor, fragments of their legacy were preserved in odd places. Courtyard mosaics, mosque fountains, the margins of children's school books. The empire may have moved on, but the petals never quite disappeared. Historians still argue whether the Tulip Era deserves its place in history, as a symbol of waste or wonder. But standing here, holding this chipped tile in your hand, you realize something simple. It doesn't need to be justified. It just was. A chapter. a bloom. A dream shared in gardens, in ink, in too expensive bulbs, and too late apologies. And though the tiles have cracked and the petals have fallen, some part of it remains. You return to the palace one final time. Not through the front, not even through the garden gate, but around the side where the walls are lower and the paths are lined with moss. The guards nod, not because they remember you, but because this part of the palace no longer needs guarding. You slip past a marble arch where once silk banners fluttered with tulip sigils. It's faded now. You trace the threads with your fingers and imagine what it must have looked like in full bloom. Red on white, silk against sky, petals dancing like flags. You find a quiet spot in the garden, what remains of it. The soil has been turned, the signs taken down. Only a few tulips remain, stubborn or forgotten. One leans hard to the left, another curls like it's listening. You sit beside them. No one says anything anymore. No one's naming, pricing, ranking, comparing. The tulips aren't performers now. They're survivors. And you're not a guest anymore. You're part of the quiet. Here's your mainstream fact. Although the Tulip Era ended abruptly, its aesthetic influence persisted. Ottoman design continued to incorporate tulip motifs on tiles, textiles, manuscripts for generations. The bloom, once scandalous, became sacred again. Familiar, softened by time. You hear the faint rattle of a watering can behind you. A gardener, new, maybe, or simply one who outlasted the politics, hums to himself. He doesn't look at you, doesn't ask questions, just tends, because the work goes on. As evening settles, you stand to leave. Your footsteps are lighter now, less like a tourist in time and more like a resident of its memory. On your way back to your quarters, you pass the painter again, the one who once illustrated tulips with a single-hair brush. He's older now. Or maybe it's just the lighting. He nods to you and opens his book. Inside, a single tulip, drawn in charcoal. No color, no flare, just shadow and curve. He says without looking up, I still see them, even when they're gone. You nod and walk on. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the years that followed, many poets and painters quietly reintroduced tulips into their work, disguising them as metaphors for memory, loss, or fleeting love. One anonymous poem simply ends with the line, "And when spring returned, I dared not ask whose garden it was." Historians still argue whether the Tulip Era was foolish or glorious, decadent or daring. But you know now that history doesn't settle neatly. It petals, it spreads, it seeds, and in corners no one notices, it blooms again. You return to your room, the windows open. A breeze carries in the scent of damp earth and late spring air. On your table sits the tulip tile from the market, catching the moonlight like a prayer. You lie down. Close your eyes. Let petals fall where they may. You close your eyes. Let the lanterns fade. Let the scent of crushed petals and old soil drift gently out the window. Let the whispered names of forgotten bulbs dissolve into the hush. Let it all slow, the water in the fountains, the rustle of garden trees, the memory of the bloom. Because you've walked the garden path. You've watched the rise, the shine, the shimmer. And you've seen what happens when something so delicate is asked to carry the weight of empire. But now, you can set it down. Let your breath soften. Let your limbs sink gently into the bedding. No scrolls to read. No names to remember. Just a quiet stretch of earth and a flower that didn't ask for this much attention. Let the tile on your nightstand be enough. Let the last lines of those poems blur into comfort. Let the silence feel like silk. Because somewhere, even now, a tulip is blooming. Not for kings. Not for show. Just because that's what it does. Just because it's time. And you've watched it all unfold. Now breathe in, slow and steady. Breathe out, slower still. The bloom has passed, but the peace remains, and now at last you can rest. The bulbs are buried, the ledgers are closed, the story is written. End of sweet dreams.